Alrighty then. Let's go. By the way, I just put these up right now as my memes of the day. And I was kind of thinking I need to make a meme that references Back to the Future, that references the Avengers, that references any science fiction, back in time movies, and just ask, why didn't they warn us about 2020? Obviously because they had no idea. But I'm just saying, like, come on, Back to the Future. Doc, you should have told us. You went to 2015. You went to 2015. You couldn't go to 2020 and just let us know what really happened there, man? Come on. We know that the Cubs won the World Series. We get that. That's cool. That was an amazing prediction. But, like, pandemic is a little bit more important. Jerks. All right. Let's go. Just a reminder, please do the mid-semester survey. It literally takes 90 seconds. In fact, right now, hit pause, do the survey. I'll wait. And we're back. Just a reminder for the assignment. Here are the 5 questions to answer. 1, explain the difference between an open and closed society. Provide an example of each. I talked about that the very first lecture of this topic. 2, describe the social hierarchy of India in the classical period. What is the fundamental basis for an individual's caste? If I recall correctly, that was lecture number 2. Discuss at least 2 theories of race in the 19th century. How do these theories rationalize ethnic people as superior or inferior? I believe that was topic number 1. Examine Olympe de Gouges, 1791, writing on the Declaration of Rights of Women. What are some of the rights of women articulated in this document? How do these declarations make life better for women? We did that in the live lecture. And then 5, discuss the steps towards abolition of slavery worldwide in the 19th century. Why does emancipation not necessarily translate into equality? Let's get into that right now. So today we're going to trace the evolution of the concept of race across cultures. Bada bing! Here's the reading for this topic that please just skim through. Here we go. All right. We did class last week. We did gender in person. We're doing race right now. So I love doing this question live, but we don't get to do it. So I need you to answer these. There's 4 of these, I think, in a row. Answer them just honestly. Don't fast forward and look at what the next question is until you've answered the first one. 1 sentence each, 2 sentences each, that kind of thing. So, what if aliens came down from space today? What would your first reaction be? Please hit pause, answer this. Ready, set, go. And we're back. Okay, now, there are multiple of these. What if those same aliens came down and spoke a language you understood? What if those aliens didn't speak a language you understood? So that was a 2-part question. Again, that's saying what's a you? Just a sentence or 2 of each. What do you say? Ready, set, go. And we're back. What if you understood those aliens and they discussed the existence of a God close enough to our own understanding of what God is or could be? And then part 2, what if they did not reference a God close to the one that you know could be? How would you respond to both? Go ahead and pause. Ready, set, go. And we're back. Alright, so real quick. So what was that? 3. Okay, so only 3 of them. For extra credit, I can't give you extra credit, but tell me, what is this an image of? What pop culture media is it from? Alright, so race is a social invention. I talked about this in my U.S. history class. I didn't talk about it with you. So, race is a social invention. It does not exist on any scientific level. It doesn't. No matter what your skin color is, no matter what your hair color is, no matter what part of the world you're from, we are literally at a genetic level and in our DNA closer genetically than monkeys are to one another. They are more farther than apes. I think it's apes. Apes are to one another. They are more different from one another than human beings are. We are the same species. Yes, there are small differences, but overall, genetically speaking, there is no scientific basis for the idea of race. There are not multiple races. There is one race, human being. No matter what you look like, that is what you are. That is who I am. That is who we all are. And that is all there is. There is nothing else. So the idea of race, and that is all it is, an idea and it's a false idea. It's a false narrative. Anybody, the idea of racism, it is based on a false scientific principle because race in and of itself does not exist. Human race. There is the human race. There are no multiple races within the human race. So the idea of race has undergone several transformations throughout history. In the 15th and 16th centuries, explorers exposed Europeans to diverse groups of people, entirely different from the humans they had known throughout human history, so they thought. Hence the alien reference. Like, all of a sudden, Columbus gets here and he runs into people who were not Indian, who they knew what an Indian looked like and sounded like, and, the language they would speak, so on and so forth. And they're now meeting people on the North American continent going, where are you from? They had no idea what was going on. These people are characterized as being a different race of people. Totally ignorantly. I mean, I'll give them that. They were ignorant. The Europeans were ignorant. Now, all ignorance means is that it's a lack of knowledge and understanding. From, further understanding of, well, and then, then that ignorance is passed down for generations, centuries, literally. But, in a modern sense, we have the information, the genetic, scientific information to prove, and this, by the way, has been proven for decades, that there is no such thing as multiple human races. There is just the human race. We're all the same. So, once a person who attaches themselves to that concept, the moment they are told, oh, by the way, there's no such thing as race outside of the human race, then that ignorance turns into something else entirely. It turns into bigotry. I mean, it's willful ignorance, which is just willful anger, that kind of thing. So, unfortunately, this exposure to these other people led to slavery. Why? I'm not looking for a what say you. I would have asked that in class, but it's not a what say you I'm going to answer here, because I'm going to answer it soon. Race became the catalyst to slavery, especially African slavery. Well, why? However, not all slaves came from Africa. They were other peoples from conquered territories where the people were considered an inferior race. Why? So, all of this comes down to something very simple, and again, it's very ignorant. The catalyst for racial hierarchies and the dividing up of relative worth and relative societies came after about 1789 and the rise of modern nationalism in Europe thanks to the French Revolution. So after the French Revolution, many European countries became nations, defined particularly by the fact that citizenship would now be based on birth, residency within a national territory, and allegiance to a law or constitution. So again, I sometimes get mixed up because some of these concepts I teach in the U.S. history class at the same time as the world history class, so I know that I've discussed this at some point, but I'll repeat myself if it is this class very briefly. Prior to that point, that concept of race, based on nationalism, it didn't exist. I mean, race, the idea on a fundamental level, it was minor, if you will. Now, why did Europeans become attracted to the enslaving Africans? Basically because of technological prowess. They had the technology to do it. They were superior, technologically, and the reason why I was hesitant there was intellectually as well. And it's not that the Africans were dumb. They were ignorant. They just didn't have the same level of education that Europeans had. But that was just based on timing. They've got that education now, so obviously there's no, or at least they have access to it. Just based on modern technology. So it's like today, ignorance is just based on a lack of education. The information, though, is there. And then, of course, technologically, the Europeans had developed far superior weapons to the bows and arrows and the spears that Africans had, because they had guns. They could shoot from farther away. They had explosives that Africans didn't have. So technologically, intellectually, they were superior, and they were able to just kind of wield that superiority over the Africans. If the Africans had comparable weaponry, comparable intelligence on some level, and again, I say intelligence strictly from the perspective of the Europeans had information and Africans did not, then the Europeans would have never been able to enslave them. They would have fought to a standstill, presumably, or the Africans could have overcome the European, who knows? It's just the scenario would have been entirely different. The idea of enslavement strictly came initially from the concept of just timing. That's literally all it was. So then the definition of what placed a person under a nationality and thus which placed a person under a race, and do I have it on the slide? Okay. In the defining nature of, or in the nature of defining nationalism, they not only defined what made a person fall under a particular national, flag, if you will, or national, racial grouping, and at the same time excluded people. They defined exclusions for other people. So we have that same thing going on at the same time. We're defining what places a person inside this group while at the same time defining why other people are out of it. So, which is all in and of itself, and this is a word that I've used 1,000 times here, it was a justification. They justified how to exclude people out through quasi-scientific means, quasi-intellectual means, so on and so forth. So now this one is a what say you. Is there anything wrong with nationalism? Wrong with that being nationalism? Again, hit pause, answer that question. Ready, set, the answer is why or why not. Ready, set, go. And we're back. Alright, so what is nationalism? Don't worry, you don't have to answer this question. If we were in class, I would ask you to answer it in this or not. Nationalism, in a sense, was a great equalizer, placing all those living within a national territory on an equal footing with one another, under that equal footing, under that flag, and then with one another on an international sense. Thus, placing Englishmen in the same kind of social construct as Frenchmen, placing them in the same social construct as Spaniards, Italians, Germans, Poles, Danes, and so on. Social and economic class, it was believed, would not matter thus. All citizens would be equal based on their rights as human beings. It's a wonderful idea. It probably is the one truth, but was it fulfilled to its fullest? So, as I said, defining inclusion in the nation was also invariably a process of exclusion, as I just mentioned. Nationalists in the 1800s, even deliberately non-racist ones, worked very hard to define not only who belonged, but by default who did not. So, even non-racist ones did. However, the racist ones, and again, the idea of racism is based on a false premise. It has been scientifically proven that race does not exist. However, those who chose to be bigoted, they then used nationalism and the definition of nationalism as a justification for excluding some from their group, from their nation, from their race, what have you. Behaviors, attitudes, language, dress, and appearance, all of that played roles in assessing who was of one nation and who was not. In a generic sense, it makes sense. It makes it easy to kind of define who groups of people are. But that is strictly from a cultural perspective. It is just absolutely not from a racial perspective. So cultural nationalism and the rise of romanticism that sought to explore the passionate, irrational side of humanity worked together to fashion the ethnic nation. So that which would be beyond racial nations. Excuse me. Cultural nations. It would be beyond cultural nations, because obviously you might have people who look totally different, but who share the same culture. Thus, they are culturally equal. But it's that skin difference that then defined the ethnic nations, and people tried to purify their nation of those ethnic people who looked different from what was considered the ethnic pure national group. So, a state defined by ethnicity saw itself as a spiritual entity. Citizenship tied to a soul that one was born with, and to an uncontrollable, indelible personal drive to act, think, and feel in a particular way. And actually, I lost a word there. Citizenship was tied to a soul that one was born with. Thus, in other words, you were born a part of that nation based on your appearance, based on your background, based on your family lineage, so on and so forth. Alright, so the African race. I'm going to pause for just 2 seconds. Alright, so the African race. When some Englishmen entered slave trading directly, many of the English public actually had misgivings about the slave trade. It was not in other words, it was not an openly accepted practice. Now remember, we're talking 1500s when this happened, so I definitely go through this in my American history class, my U.S. history class. Just remember, some people like to tie slavery to the United States. The United States was forced, unfortunately, to adopt slavery. It is not something the United States originated. It existed for hundreds of years before the United States, in the African sense, in the slave trade sense. It existed for hundreds of years prior to the United States even being an idea. It was an English, well, from the American side, it was an English practice. It actually started with the Portuguese, so it wasn't even the English who actually started it. And it was something that developed over time and had existed economically on this continent, again, for centuries before it existed. I should say, not economically, obviously it existed in practice, but it became certain economies, and obviously from the American sense, we think of the South. Their economy became very tied to it well before the country came into existence. So that said, when some Englishmen entered into slave trading directly, many of the English public had misgivings about this practice. It was an era when the ideals of equality, justice, democracy, and human rights were becoming dominant features of Western political philosophy, and thus at the Age of Enlightenment, basically. And so when the Age of Enlightenment began, it was, and these ideas are now being passed forward or passed around in regards to Europeans and whites in particular, for this to then begin to occur at the same time, it seemed very counterintuitive. Oops. So those involved in the trade rationalized, and I remember I use that word all the time, those involved in the trade who rationalized their actions by arguing that the Africans were heathens after all, that by not being Christian, and it was a Christian duty to save their souls. And if we look at Christendom from the perspective of it is the one true faith, it is the one true religion, that okay, maybe their souls could have been saved somehow because many of them were converted to Christianity. By the time, the Civil War ended, most of the former slaves were devoutly Christian. Yes, okay, fine, but it didn't mean that in order for them to be Christianized and to be converted and to be evangelized, that they needed to be abducted and that they needed to be sold into slavery, and then their progeny, their offspring, their children needed to be sold into slavery generation after generation as well. So, with the rise of anti-slavery movements, slave traders and owners created further justifications for the practice of owning other humans based on quasi-science. So, focusing on physical differences, they used the notion of a natural inferiority of Africans, and thus their God-given suitability for slavery. Such arguments became more frequent and strident from the end of the 18th century on, that is the end of the 1700s, that is about the time that the United States came into existence, and the northern former colonies, now states, were already outlawing slavery in their region, and the characterizations of Africans became thus more negative. So, how did these characterizations come to pass? Ethnography. So, pro-slavery leaders formulated a new ideology. They made it up out of thin air to justify the practice that merged all Europeans together, rich and poor, fashioning a social system of ranked, physically distinct groups. The model for race and races was the great chain of being, or scale of nature, or in Latin, scala naturae, a semi-scientific theory of a natural hierarchy of all living things derived from classical Greek writings. Which, okay, let's think of it from the perspective of the food chain. Yes, that sort of thing does exist. It's a real thing. Human beings are at the top of the food chain. But do human beings then further break down and really take that, if we're the top rung, does that top rung that get broken down into multiple rungs that kind of equal the one rung of humanity? So the physical features of different groups became markers or symbols of their status on their scale, which justified their positions within their social system. And again, I use that word justified openly. Race ideology proclaimed that the social, spiritual, moral, and intellectual inequality of different groups was, like their physical traits, natural, innate, inherited, and unalterable. Thus, a person born into a position that placed themselves in Africa immediately made them ripe for slavery, born into it, destined for it, created for it, so on and so forth. So said these pro-slavery advocates. From here we see the structuring of ideological components of race. The term race, which had been a classificatory term like type or kind, that's really all it meant, and was very ambiguous, meaning it was nebulous. It had no, it was free form. It was not solid. Certainly there was nothing scientific to prove it. It became more widely used in the 18th century and further crystallized into a distinct reference for Africans, Indians, and Europeans. Now, who had designed this? The Europeans. Why? To place themselves at the top of the food chain. By, the tip top of the food chain. By focusing on the physical and status differences between the conquered and enslaved peoples, the Europeans, the emerging ideology linked the socio-political status and physical traits together to create a new form of social identity. 18th century biologists and anthropologists, these are scientists after all, classified human beings according to the color of their skin, physical features, language, as if that has anything to do with anything, and their stage in civilization, as if that has anything to do with anything. So again, I mean, in that case, language, it's an irrelevant construct. It's something that develops just based on regional, I'm not even going to get into it. There are a million variables that play into how a language develops. How that has anything to do with a person's rung on the food chain makes no sense. It's entirely illogical if you look at it on its face. Then secondarily, their stage of civilization. Of course, somebody's going to be first, and the Europeans happen to be first, technologically, in many ways. And sure, politically, they were first to reach ideas of democracy and on a national, widespread scale. Philosophically, religion, yeah, okay, they were first. That's fine, and it would make sense that if they were first in one area, they were going to be first in others as well, just because it was all going to kind of progress at similar traits. How does that place them at the top of the food chain? Once that information is shared, then everybody else is on an equal footing of knowledge. It's not like that one particular generation in the late 18th century invented all of that stuff. It had been passed down from generation to generation as ideas evolved on all of these constructs and all of these topics. The second that information is shared with an African, boom, he's on the same footing. The second information is all shared with an Indian, boom, he's on the same footing. An East Asian, boom. I mean, it's an illogical, irrational, entirely unscientific means of classifying. And yet here we have scientists, biologists, and anthropologists who were doing that very thing. So this shifted the rationalization of race from religious terms, remember, of the soul, to scientific rationale or claims to support a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. It's all made up, yo. I don't know why I said yo. I meant to say y'all. It's all made up, y'all. The science, or phrenology, claimed to demonstrate that the structure of the skull, especially the jaw formation and facial angles, revealed the position of various races on the evolutionary scale. That makes sense. And further, a debate raged on whether there had been one creation for all mankind, monogenism, or several, polygenism. In other words, did all mankind evolve or originate with Adam and Eve, or were there maybe multiple Adam and Eves, one for the white race, air quote, one for the African race, air quote, one for the Asian race, air quote, so on and so forth. And actually, I want to pause. I want to pull up something real quick. You'll never know I was gone. Where's the thing? Okay, so I just real quick want to show you a couple other slides I don't have in the world history lecture. I do in the U.S. history lecture. But in terms of, you're going to just see me flipping back and forth real quick. In terms of this idea that phrenology claims to demonstrate that the structure of the skull, especially the jaw formation and facial angles, revealed the position of various races on an individual scale, evolutionary scale, excuse me. I want you to look at exactly what that means. What was the science of studying the skull? Your jaw's going to drop. Samuel Morton was one of these racial scientists. In the first half of the 19th century, so that is the first half of the 1800s, and decades before Charles Darwin, who developed the idea of survival of the fittest in terms of species that was then passed over to mankind. He studied skulls from around the world different races, air quote, filling them with pepper seeds and later a lead shot. And dependent, apparently I spelled dependent wrong, dependent upon the amount of each pepper seeds or lead shot, they can be placed into the brain casings. In other words, he took off the skull. He then argued that there were 5 races, and the variances in brain casings were evidence of specific abilities of each race. What? Because he could fill multiple skulls with pepper seeds or lead shot, and I'm sure that it had to do with what is too little, what is too much. Look at the Europeans, it's just right. His quote-unquote scientific findings were used to further argue for slavery, as the amount of lead shot in the brain casing was proof that Caucasians were ultimately the most intelligent. Today, Samuel Morton is known as the father of scientific racism. Now, I'll offer you one more bit of information. So, as I said, is it this one? As I said, there is no scientific basis for race. Well, back in the late throughout the 90s, there was this big race to map the human genome. We were developing as a society the technology to do such a thing, and there are billions of different codes, I think is the right word, sequences, I guess, to the human genome. So it's it was a very, very, very extensive process. Well, I remember following this process. I was a kid growing up, and this thing was just absolutely fascinating to me. I remember seeing news reports on it for many, many years. Well, then, in June of 2000, in a White House ceremony, the results of the completion of the first sequencing of the human genome was announced, for which DNA was intentionally gathered from different races to guarantee that the complete genome was accurately recorded. Craig Venter, this guy right here, one of the 2 gentlemen, here's the other one, and the guy in the middle is Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton. Craig Venter, the guy on the left, one of the fathers of DNA sequencing, said, quote, "The concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis." End quote. So, again, now granted, to cut Samuel Morton a little bit of slack, he was filling skulls with pepper. And so, that was science of the day, but, he didn't have access to the machines that could decode the human gene. He didn't know what DNA was. That wouldn't be discovered for decades after Morton. So it's like, you kind of give him a little bit of slack, like, hey, I guess back then science was less, scientific and more just filling a bowl full of cereal and going, oh, this one holds more Cheerios. But that was considered science, and that was what helped to fulfill this idea of scientific racism. All right, so back to our stuff. So, polygenists, those who believed that mankind evolved from multiple Adams and Eves, because hence that's why there's so many differences in the way we look, stressed the unequal nature of the various creations, again, of the 5 species, the 5 races. This theory later mingled with general evolutionary theories, including Charles Darwin's theory on natural selection, and concepts of arrested development to create an atmosphere congenial to racial stereotyping, as seen in works like The Races of Europe, written by William Ripley in 1899. Believe it or not. So, what say you? Please don't talk to your neighbors. You can't see them. Please hit pause, answer this in your email. Can the human race be improved through genetics? Or, in other words, eugenics? Should parents be able to decide sex, hair color, gender, sexuality? Should abortion be a part of that in terms of eugenics? And then, what about this decision to end a particular disease or imperfect trait? Is it this decision, as if there was one? What about the decision to end a particular disease or imperfect trait? Of a particular imperfect trait whose choice is what is imperfect. And then after that imperfect trait is gone, well then what? Is that just one, or is there one imperfect trait, or are there many? And if you get rid of a couple of the big ones, then how far do we go? This is kind of a loaded one, or I shouldn't say loaded, I don't mean for it to be loaded, but it's kind of a complex one. So answer all of these in a few sentences. Take your time. As you can see by the clock, this is a short lecture. So hit pause, ready, set, go, and we're back. So, racial definitions. Again, Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species. He did not originate the concept of evolution, but rather formulated the principle of natural selection, which explained how species had changed and evolved over time, which was then, now granted, he was looking at plants and insects, but eventually that was placed on human beings to prove, hey, look, this is why we're all different, because we came from whatever, fish or something. The process is natural and mechanistic, meaning that it's like regimented, requiring no guiding mind, thus no God, behind the development of nature, which obviously contradicted the biblical narrative of the Creator and undermined arguments for the existence of God as the universe's designer. I.e., in other words, if physical and organic change is constant, so could society, values, customs, and beliefs. Thus, mankind can change in ways that are totally different and, evolutionary from generations past. Then, this is what was applied. So then natural selection was then applied. Where did it go? There we go. Then natural selection was applied to society, as I say here. And so these people, social Darwinists, applied the principles of Darwin's natural selection to the struggle of human relationships and called it survival of the fittest, which became scientifically backed and gained prestige around the Western world in this justification for groups being superior to others and groups being inferior to others. Herbert Spencer was a British philosopher who believed that human society progressed through competition. He was economically thinking. I think most people would argue that there is accuracy to that, but it shouldn't necessarily mean death. And survival of the fittest obviously does mean death, because survival implies somebody surviving while others perish. Competition shouldn't necessarily mean, in economically speaking, shouldn't necessarily mean one death. It might mean one's economic failure, but it should also imply that there is the ability to continue to develop beyond that. So, what say you? What is it? Can the principles of economic competitiveness be applied on a societal level? If not, why do we have sports? Go ahead and pause. Ready, set, go. I'm going to take a sip here. And we're back. So, if the weak receive too much protection, the rest of humankind is the loser, so say the eugenicists. To struggle against one fellow human beings is an ethical imperative. The concept could then justify not aiding the poor and the working class, or to rationalize domination of colonial peoples, or to advocate for aggressive competition among nations. So, okay. There should be no justification, obviously, for not aiding the poor, although that was what the eugenicists said. That's what the social Darwinists said, was let the poor die, because obviously they're poor because they don't have the intellectual ability to become wealthy. The wealthy weren't just lucky or had a great idea. The wealthy had obviously some level of mental superiority. But then again, I use that word rationalization all the time because that's what it was. It was then further used to rationalize domination of colonial peoples, or to advocate for aggressive competition among nations. Now, the aggressive competition, again, among nations could be rationalized, I would argue, to a certain extent, so long as that extent does not necessarily mean the death of somebody just for another country's success. Maybe lack of, that's too heavy of a conversation. But regardless, they were arguing death. They were arguing destruction. They were even arguing eradication. That's what eugenicists argue. This then is what gets us into slavery. So, the inclusion of the New World in the international economy, that is, the North and South American continents, were among the most important events in modern history, and are based on slavery. Europeans brought at least 8 million black men, women, and children out of Africa to the Western Hemisphere between the 16th and 19th centuries, and slavery transformed the Atlantic into a complex trading area. The trade united North and South America, Europe, and Africa through the movement of people's goods, services, credit, and capital. What do we need to know? Well, that slavery was a product of globalization at that time. Its effects on Africa and the Americas, and the impact of the Enlightenment ideas on its eventual abolition. So a very brief history of African slavery. Slavery hasn't existed since antiquity. Again, it isn't, and I only say this just because so many people for some reason place slavery on America. It existed before America was even an idea. It existed before Europe even reached any stage of enlightenment. Slavery has literally existed from the beginning of man. It became common in Africa first after the Bantu migrations spread agriculture to all parts of the continent. So as you can see, you've got a map of the Bantu migration. Again, we're talking tens of thousands of years ago. Most slaves in Africa began as war captives, which was very, very common for thousands of years. You capture people, a society captured another society, defeated another society, and then took the survivors into captivity and slavery. Once enslaved, an individual had no personal or civil rights. Owners could order slaves to do any kind of work, punish them, and sell them as chattel, meaning sell them as property. Most slaves worked as cultivators, in other words, worked as farmers, basically. So African law did not recognize individual land ownership. So wealth and power in Africa came from not owning land, but by controlling human labor that made it productive. Slaves were a form of investment and a sign of wealth. Now again, we're talking about Africans enslaving Africans here. After the 8th century, Muslim merchants from North Africa, Arabia, and Persia sought African slaves for trade in the Mediterranean basin, Southwest Asia, India, and as far away as Southeast Asia and China. The Islamic slave trade lasted into the 20th century, meaning the 1900s, hundreds of years, at least 100 years after American slavery ended, and resulted in the deportation of as many as 10 million Africans. And you can see the slave trade routes all through Africa occurring via these Muslim merchants. By the time Europeans arrived in sub-Saharan Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries, the slave trade was a well-established feature in African society. Extraordinarily, unfortunately. A detailed system for capturing, selling, and distributing slaves had been in place for over 500 years before the Portuguese even got there. With the arrival of the Europeans and the demand for slaves in the Americas, the slave trade, though, expanded dramatically. Now, why specifically? How specifically did it expand dramatically? Very simply, technology. The Europeans had technology to pull this off. They had the technology for death through weaponry, and they had the technology for transport via their shipping. Again, I talk about this in U.S. history. I'm almost tempted to pull up a U.S. history lecture, but I won't. But essentially, there were a number of preconditions for Western expansion by Europe, meaning, looking towards the New World and then coming to the New World and trying to discover and conquer and control land on the North and South American continents. And one of the preconditions, though, was shipping technology. Having boats big enough to be able to pull off such an endeavor, and having sails that could not only move ships at a quick enough speed to make trips efficient and capable, but also to be able to allow them to move against the wind. That was also a very, very important thing. It's very easy to sail with the wind, but you've also got to be able to sail against the wind, and so they had to be able to develop the technology to be able to pull that off. Not something that existed on the African continent or with any other, subset of humanity on the planet, save for the Europeans themselves. So the number of slaves ultimately brought to the Americas, the number one criminal in this were the Portuguese. They captured some 5.8 million slaves themselves, bringing them primarily to Brazil and South America. Number two is Great Britain. They captured about 3.2 million, most of which were brought to North America, which is where most of American slaves came from. Again, later. 1.3 million were French. These are kind of captured and often left where they were, but used on their continents. I mean, like Africa, but also somewhat in North America. But regardless, number 3 is France with 1.3 million. Number 4 is Spain, over 1 million. Number 5 then is the Netherlands, 554,000. Number 6, granted the United States got a late start, but still number 6, and truthfully, I mean, got a late start. Less than 200,000 of the 300,000 came after 1776. I shouldn't say the majority, but probably, I guess I'd have to do the math real quick. It looks like, almost an equal amount came beforehand, which could be attributed to Great Britain as well, because they were obviously English subjects. And then what is that number? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then number 7 would be Denmark and 100,000. So all total is around 12.5 million slaves brought from European traders into, captured from Africa by European traders. But again, did it originate with the United States? No, the United States were forced to accept the practice for some time. But, and then again, finished 5th place among the big 6, if you will. So Portuguese, again, the Portuguese did it first. The Portuguese began capturing slaves in Africa in the 15th century, but quickly learned it was easier to just buy them and from Africans. They were buying slaves, Africans from Africans. In Europe, slaves usually worked as miners, porters, or domestic servants, since free peasants and serfs cultivated the land. When the Portuguese discovered the Azores, Madeira, Cape Verde Islands, and Sao Tome in the 15th century, they were all uninhabited. And thus the Portuguese population was too small to provide a large number of colonists, so it was just easier to ship in Africans. So the sugar plantations required a large labor force, and thus slaves filled this demand. By the 1520s, some 2,000 slaves per year were shipped to Sao Tome alone. Some thereafter, Portuguese entrepreneurs extended the use of slave labor into South America. Eventually, Brazil would become the wealthiest of the sugar-producing lands in the Western Hemisphere, and again, they would get the most of the slaves. So, timeline for abolition of slavery. 1813 was really oh wait, I feel like... Okay, yeah. 1813 was really the marker for it. Gradual emancipation was adopted in Argentina. Gradually, then a year later in Colombia, Chile, 1823, Central America, 1824, Mexico, 1829, Bolivia, 31. The Abolition of Slavery Act was passed in Britain, which resulted in the completion of emancipation by 1838. Then, yada, 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 yada. Obviously, then, the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in the United States in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. And then slavery is abolished in the United States as a result of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution at the end of the Civil War in 1865, and so on and so forth. So, we are not done. I need to just pull up one more thing. All right, here. This will be our last little bit. I just need to get you emancipation. Okay, so I just need to bring you guys back over here. Go back there. Okay, you should have all seen this. All right. So, okay, I'm skipping all this. I just need to get you emancipation. Okay, we did abolition. Okay, so I did want to stop at the abolition of slavery in the United States. So, granted, again, we had the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but that was on a national level. Colonies and states, actually, by this point they were states, began getting rid of abolition well before. So, 1780, Pennsylvania began gradual abolition of slavery. By 1783, Massachusetts ruled that slavery was unconstitutional. Also, gradual emancipation of New Hampshire began. 1784, Connecticut and Rhode Island each began gradual emancipation. In 1788, the Northwest Territories were declared slave-free. And I'm sorry that this is white. I should have made it black, but I'm not going to change it right now. And then in 1794, the United States banned the slave trade and the export of slaves on foreign ships, not oar hips. In 1799, New York began gradual emancipation. In 1800, Americans are banned from the international slave trade by 1800. In 1802, Ohio is admitted as a slave state, but in 1804, New Jersey abolished slavery. In 1807, the Michigan Territory is deemed free. 1808, both the importation and exportation of slaves in the United States is made illegal. That was based on a constitutional mandate that Congress could not affect slavery for 20 years. And so when the Constitution came into effect in 1788, the clock was immediately ticking, and literally on day one of its possible banning of the importation and exportation of slaves in 1808, it happened. Like, they were waiting for that day and had that bill ready to be signed by by President Jefferson, in fact. Gradual amendments. Okay, so then blah, 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 blah. India Supreme Court ended slavery in 1820. Abolition. So anyway, so you can just see that the underlying ones are the American ones. The United States started ending slavery very, very early, and it's something I've mentioned in the past. Okay, so I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. These are just some pop culture references. Oh, what's going on over here? I did not click on these. Don't open them. Okay, so if you want to watch these, though, I recommend it. Come on. William Wilberforce. Okay. Okay, so we'll do this. So William Wilberforce was an English philanthropist who was elected to Parliament in 1780. He came from a wealthy business family. He was repulsed from a young age by slavery on religious and moral grounds, which is why, I'm just flipping back real quick, which is why many of the Northern American states were repulsed and ended slavery so quickly as well. Remember, the United States were very religious, and the northern states had heavy Puritan roots. Puritans were ardently against slavery. So, in 1789, he delivered a stirring abolition speech to the House of Commons and repeatedly introduced the abolition bill to Parliament for years until it finally passed in 1807. By the way, I highly, highly, highly recommend the movie Amazing Grace. It is about him. It's a fantastic movie. If you want to, use a pop culture reference in regards to it, I highly recommend Amazing Grace. The ministry, so why did it finally happen in 1807? Well, the Ministry of All the Talents responded positively to Wilberforce's bill, which argued for abolition in the national interest. The Foreign Slave Trade Bill, which was a separate bill, stopped 1/3 of the existing British slave trade overnight. It was thus, however, followed by a general motion to abolish the slave trade on the grounds of humanity, justice, and sound policy. 283 MPs voted in favor. However, there were a number who weren't, thereby tricking them. You see the movie, it actually does do a good job. So, slavery was still legal in the British colonies, however. However, in 1833, the Emancipation Act of all slaves, were passed, granting them full freedom 5 years later in 1838. Women played a very extensive and active role in the matter, forming anti-slavery ladies associations, taking part in widespread national petitioning, and writing and campaigning on the issue. Finally, then in the United States, Lincoln issues his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, stating, after the federal victory at Antietam, if you don't know the history of why 1863 and why did he do it, he issued it in 1862. It became legal in 1863, as you can see here. He did it 100 days before January 1st is when he announced it. So again, if you want to know the history of that in particular, why the Emancipation Proclamation and why right after the Battle of Antietam, I actually don't necessarily have a movie for you to watch, but definitely just kind of look into it at Google if you don't know the information. It's a very fascinating history. He wanted to issue the Emancipation Proclamation much earlier. I'll just give the story. It's very, very short. I'll bet I can get it done in 1 minute. He basically wanted to issue the Emancipation Proclamation very early on in the war. The problem, though, is the Confederates were actually winning a number of battles, and his Secretary of State, in particular, I have to pause because I want him to get his name. Give me a second. Okay, there we go. Sorry, William Seward. I didn't even have to look it up. I just needed to stop talking for a moment. The Secretary of State, William Seward, actually, gave him some very sound advice and offered some great strategy and just said, hey, we're losing battles right now. The war is kind of a tie, and Unionists, Northerners aren't feeling all that great, and Southerners are feeling very good, like they might actually pull this off. He goes, don't issue the Emancipation Proclamation right now because it'll come off as desperate, and thus it won't hold any real authority. People won't think you're serious about it. He goes, wait until after we have a big victory in battle and Northerners are feeling really good. Build on that enthusiasm, and at that point make slavery the issue. So Lincoln waited. He wasn't happy, but he thought it was fantastic advice. He took that advice. He waited. The Union Army won the Battle of Antietam, although it was kind of a mild battle, but he's like, I'll take it. I want to make this the issue. And thus issued the Emancipation Proclamation 100 days before January 1st of 1863. And he said, quote, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. So he designated all slaves in the South, in those southern states that were in rebellion, as free. He actually didn't think that he could do it in the North because he felt that the Supreme Court would overturn it because of, when I talk sometimes I need to stop talking for a second so I can gather my thoughts, because of the Dred Scott case. So the Supreme Court upheld slavery already just several years before, and actually didn't just uphold slavery, it instituted slavery across the entire country unabated. So he didn't think that he could legally emancipate slaves in the North because it would be brought to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court would overrule him, and that would just look really bad. That might continue slavery forever. So what he did is he felt, well, these states are in rebellion, thus they're not under the Constitution, therefore this is an act of war, and the emancipation is in and of itself an extension of war, of the Union fighting the war. So therefore, if I mark them, make them free down there, it can't be sued because the southern states can't sue. Blah blah blah. So it was very political. It was brilliant on all fronts. And that is all. You've already got gender. So we are done. Like I said, it was a little bit shorter. Make sure that you email me all your what say yous, and I love you all. Have a great weekend. I will see you next week. Be safe, be healthy, have fun, and avoid COVID at all costs. Peace.